Hello everyone, this is James Shore with another test-driven JavaScript video. I'm recording this on March 5th, 2013, and we're picking up right where we left off in the last episode. What we're working on here in this chapter is abstraction and design. In our last chapter, we got our WeWikiPaint application working so that you could draw on the screen. Now what we need to do, however, is we really need to get the design improved. Right now, the test code is just so large that I actually have trouble finding my way around it. So what we've been doing is we've created a fundamental abstraction, the DOM element abstraction, as a place to contain one of our core concepts, which of course is the DOM element. Now there is jQuery and there is the basic DOM API. You might ask yourself, why not just use that? Well, the answer is that this gives us something that we can put useful functions into, gives us something that we can control, so that when we need to change the way we interact with jQuery, or maybe get rid of jQuery entirely, or change the way we interact with the DOM, there's just one place to do it. That's the idea of once and only once. Every concept that's important to your system should be represented once in that system, and only once. You might have also heard this as the dry principle, don't repeat yourself, but I like once and only once because it emphasizes how important it is that every concept have a place. Not just that it not be repeated, but that it explicitly has a place. And this concept of DOM elements is really key to us. So in the last episode, what we did was we moved our relative offset and page offset functions into here. And that's working great. We can run our tests and we can see that work. What I'd like to do in this episode is I'd like to turn this module, this DOM element module, into a proper object-oriented system. So right now, you just call functions. You call WeWikiPaint.RelativeOffset, and it works. But what I want it to do now, rather than saying WeWikiPaint.RelativeOffset, I actually want it to be object-oriented. Basically, I want you to be able to say, given the DOM element, give me the relative offset. And the reason for that is that objects are a really useful way of grouping related functions. And when you have a concept, it's often valuable, not always, but it's often valuable to take that concept and represent it as an object, especially if that concept has data associated with it, because objects allow you to group data and functions. Now in JavaScript, you can define an object very easily. You just put it in curly braces, and then you can say, you can put properties on it, or you can put functions on it, just like that. The problem with this approach is, of course, you have to define that for every object, and we don't want to do that for our DOM elements. So we need to use JavaScript's prototype-based inheritance. Now, JavaScript uses prototypes, which is different than, if you're familiar with other languages, it's different than the way other languages work. In other languages, you define a class, say DOM element, and then inside that class, you define your functions, like so. And then whenever you say new DOM element, that object will automatically have all the functions that were defined in the class. However, JavaScript doesn't use classes, at least not yet. Instead, it uses prototypes. The way it works is that in JavaScript, a child object can optionally extend the parent object. Now, this syntax doesn't actually exist, or at least not in browsers. There is an extension syntax, but I don't think I'm using it right. This is just for illustration purposes. The way this works, though, is that if you have a function in the parent, and you call that on the child, it will look first in the child object, and if it doesn't find it, it will go up to the prototype, the thing that it extended, and look there. That's how JavaScript works. Now, if that's not terribly clear, I am going to do a lessons learned video on this. If you're watching this before I've created that video, then there is a lot of good material out on the web. I'll put a link on the screen there to one of my favorites that explains how JavaScript's prototype inheritance works. It is a bit of a brain bender. It took me a while to get my head around it, but it's actually quite elegant once you're used to it. The problem, of course, is that JavaScript doesn't really embrace the prototype-based inheritance fully. That extend syntax I showed you doesn't actually work in browsers. instead, what we need to do is we have this sort of bastardized version of class-based inheritance combined with prototype inheritance. It's pretty ugly, and that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to make a DOM element, make our DOM element module object-oriented. The way we do that is we define a function to be our constructor. And by convention, we name that after our class, or our sort of our core concept here. This is going to be our constructor. So this is what we're going to call in order to create new children of the DOM element object. It would probably be a good idea to pass in the basic DOM element object. Now, the reason I'm pausing here is because I'm wondering if calling ours DOM element might be confusing. But let's call it browse. We'll take a browser DOM element, and we'll just do nothing with it for now. Now, once we have that function, we can assign, it will come with a prototype that's an empty object, and we can start creating things on that prototype. So we can say DOM element.prototype.relative offset equals that. And so from now on, if we say var object equals new DOM element, and then object.relative offset, that will work. Clear as mud, right? Yeah, this JavaScript's object stuff is complicated. I'm just going to sort of go through this and let you see it by example. And like I said, I'll put some diagrams together and really show how this works in the lessons learned video. Anyway, to make a long story short, what this will do is it will put the relative offset method, make that relative offset function available to anybody who creates a DOM element. Let's demonstrate that. Now, this should work. Let's make sure it lints properly. Yep, we're still good there. Now let's go back into here where we've got our relative offset function, and let's say var foo equals new WeWikiPaint. Actually, that's a good point. We need a way of accessing it. So let's call this var DOM element equals WeWikiPaint.DOM element equals function blah. That way it's accessible outside of here. But we don't have to say WeWikiPaint.DOM element all over the place inside of this module. So we'll say var foo equals new WeWikiPaint.DOM element, and we'll pass in our element, and then we should be able to say return foo.relative offset element page X page Y. Again, just sort of sneaking up on this problem. There, that's still working. Good. Now, because we're passing that into the constructor, we shouldn't have to pass it into this method here. So let's pull this out. Let's store that browser DOM element off into our object, which is called this in JavaScript. And now we should be able to say this .element.offset and not need that. Let's see if this works. No, it doesn't work because I didn't change the way it was called. Now let's try it. There we go. Making progress. By the way, I apologize if this is confusing. It really needs diagrams to make it clear. If you have questions, please use the comments, because I don't know how clearly this is coming across. And it's made, I think, more complicated by the fact that we're refactoring rather than building it from scratch. Let's go ahead and do the next one, though. Page offset. It's going to be very similar. In fact, I think that will work. Well, that will work because it's still using the old function, but now let's go into client test. down here at the bottom. And we'll do the same thing. We'll make a new DOM element, pass in the drawing area, and return I'm hoping that will work. Oh, it needs to be, wasn't defined, it needs to be wewikipaint.dom element. There we go. That's working. So now we can get rid of these old functions and just stick with our methods, our DOM element methods. Now, if you're familiar with JavaScript objects, you know that this is not the only way to define methods and objects. This, however, is sort of the most basic, fundamental way of doing it in JavaScript, and I prefer to do things in this sort of basic way. There's a lot of complicated, fancy ways you can build classes. The problem is that you're now depending on, well, complicated, fancy things, and other people won't necessarily be able to understand them. This does mean more typing. Luckily, you know, if you're a programmer, you probably type pretty fast, so don't worry about it too much. It involves a little more typing, yes, but it's very clear and easy to understand if you understand JavaScript. So I prefer clarity over saving typing time. This goes back to the fundamental thing that we're doing here, which is making maintainability easy, prioritizing maintainability over ease of creation. Anyway, now we've got a basic object, and that is awesome because that is really the fundamental thing that we need in order to start building this abstraction out in earnest. Before we go further though, we've got this funky foo thing going on. Rather than doing that, let's see, what I'd like to do is actually have any DOM element that we use be our own weWikiPaint DOM element. What does that mean for us? Well, let's see who's using relative offset. It's always all about drawing area, isn't it? Always passing drawing area through. Let's see, drawing area. Doing a whole bunch of stuff with jQuery there. But we get that drawing area at the beginning here, don't we? Yeah, we do. So what if we take that drawing area element and we put it in a variable? Now this would not be reentrant, but we're already saying it's not reentrant. So that's okay. Let's call that, well, let's just call it drawing area element for now. And what we'll do is we'll say drawing area element. No, we can't call it drawing area element because we're using that here. Let's call it DOM element. And we'll say DOM element equals new DOM weWikiPaint.DOM element drawing area element. Now that shouldn't break anything because we're not using it. But now that we have that defined, we can go down here to relative offset, get rid of this creation, and just say DOM element dot relative offset. That should work. No, it does not work. It's so far from working. All right, what did I do wrong? Maybe it's actually supposed to be a jQuery object. Yeah, it's got to be a jQuery object. So let's actually go into here and modify this to say jQuery element. Now we're going to want to fix this. Let's actually put it to our to-do. We want to, DOM element constructor should expect raw DOM element, not jQuery element. But we will get back to that one. That brings us to the end of our time for this episode. As usual, this is going a bit slowly, but the reason it's taking so long is because we're really figuring out some fundamental design stuff. And I'm also spending a lot of time talking through stuff like object design and or the way objects work in JavaScript. But I think as we go further along, it will start getting faster and faster. So next time, what we're going to do, we've got this working, in client.js. Yes, we have it working in client.js. Next time, we're going to get it working in client.test.js, and we're going to continue bringing more and more functions into our DOM element class, our DOM element object, and make them methods on that class, so to speak. So that is what we are going to do next time. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I will catch you next time.